Eyes are the window to the soul, but in 3D animation they are the key to either make or break your work, especially when you consider that they are the first thing you look at a frame and a complex mix of reflections, refractions, flash and fibers, which computers have a hard time with. And I would know because I've made tons of terrible eyes throughout my career, so how do animated productions do it? Hi, I'm Bao, I'm an eye-obsessed, nerdy 3D artist, and I'm gonna break down some of the techniques used in production to achieve eyes like this, and how you can use them to do it in your own 3D software like Blender. But let's start with the question, how are eyes made, really? Eyes have a white shell called sclera that fades into a glass-like bulge called cornea. Below that sits another layer where we have the iris, whose function is to let in more or less light inside. The hole through which the light enters is called pupil. Now, the most anatomically correct 3D model I've seen looked something like this, a sphere with a bulge and a squashed torus inside. The outer sphere transitions from sclera to cornea with a ramp that controls the transmission of the material. With this, the render engine on its own creates realistic shadows in the pupil and in the edges of the iris. So, is that it? Sadly, this model would create various problems in animation. First, the shadows it creates are hard to art direct, but mainly it's about the reflections. In films, we want the reflections of the eyes to be clear and readable. That's why in animation, where we tend to have bigger eyes, we usually use for the reflections a sphere that doesn't bulge. Here's the comparison between the reflections of an anatomically based eye and the kind of model that we would use in mainstream animation. You can see how in the realistic one the reflections are distorted, while in the one we would use in animation they are clear and readable. Which, by the way, ta-da! This is the model we'll work with. It's made of a sphere shaped to have the separation between the sclera, the iris, and the pupil, and the second sphere to handle all the reflections continuously. If you need help modeling it, hey, check out this short I made, because I am not old. Anyway, the magic happens when we give it shading. So I'm gonna break down the shader setup step by step so that I don't overwhelm you. I have 3 materials, just a pure black emission pupil, just pure darkness, an iris, which at the moment it'll be just a base material that's blue, and same thing, sclera, white. Now, I mix them all together. How? With my UVs. I have the UVs so that the x-axis goes around and the y-axis goes just from inwards out. You can see it clearly when we shorten the ramp. And now I use this to make masks. Just here, for example, it determines how we mix sclera to iris. And same thing with a pupil. With a pupil, notable mention, I'm using cardinal interpolation to get smoother transitions, and I'm mixing some of this shadow material in the edges of the iris to emulate what our eye anatomically does. Next thing I do, I try to give some more life into the iris. For this, you could use an image texture that's a bit more realistic or has more detail. I generally like to just simply go for a noise texture that's based on our UVs. I stretch them a bit so that the noise texture comes like this. And for the color, I just mix it in. I'm using multiply here. And what I'm also doing is just putting it in the bump to get it a bit more of this fiber look to it. And now it looks more complex and more lifelike, which is what we want. And here we can see it mixed in. Great. What can we add? Attention. Subsurface scattering. We're adding very small values because it's very small. But you can see how we're mixing some of the red because it's flesh. You can see it here in this example, how the sclera turns a bit reddish and it gives a very, very natural look. And that would be it if it weren't for one tiny detail. One word. Caustics. Caustics are these funky shadows the glass-type materials create where normal people go, uh-huh, and 3D nerds go, oh. And do eyes make them? You bet! See, in our anatomically based model, the bulge made it so that the light coming from one side of the cornea would concentrate on the opposite side of the iris, creating this beautiful natural effect. And I love this! Look how you can see this effect in Mirabel's eyes. Candle on the left, highlight on the right. In our model, we're already simulating this effect by having the iris grow inwards, but you can only go so far without it creating ugly shadows on itself. So if I need to push it further, what I do is essentially this, and nerd alert, I do an X mask that I can rotate with this operations, and a Y mask, which I then multiply together. Still, hey, can rotate it. And I have a multiply here just for handling the intensity and just mixing in some iris material. Now this iris material I can add to the shader itself so that it's doubling the amount of reflection in this area. And you can see by increasing this number, hey, I get a bit more reflection here. You can see it a bit more obviously if I can rotate it. Hey, art directing this caustic, which is nice. Another nice thing is to have, hey, reflections. Very simple, just a very basic glass material, transmission 1, roughness 0, and shadow turned off. Because if not, ugly shadows. One thing you can do though is sometimes you would need to change the pupil position, and this you do by changing the IOR. Depending on the model, this emulates what the bulge does, and if you find that you need, hey, a very crazy value that's messing up with your reflections, because increasing the IOR also increases reflections, to isolate this, you can do this, handling the refractions on one side, and so that you can turn it into crazier values, and the reflections on the other side, just having non-transmission, black material, only specular. So here you can increase and decrease the reflection, and you can add them together, and hey, reflection, refraction. But none of this fanciness will ever make sense if we don't take into account my favorite subject ever, lighting. Lighting is the main reason why these eyes look bad in these old renders of mine. In both cases, you can clearly see some flat aerolites reflected in the eyes, and that not only makes them look very digital, but makes them look messy and crowded. In animated movies, we often see this instead, a single sharp highlight on the iris that proves that the eye is shiny while retaining the simplicity and leading the viewer's attention to the character's expression. In animation, we call them eye specks or eye dots. This comes from live-action photography, where we often see the key light of a character reflected into its eyes. I find this example from Spider-Man Homecoming really cool, because in Tom Holland's eye we can see how somebody's holding a white reflector to bounce some of the sunlight that's hitting Tom and Zendaya's hair into Tom's face. It looks natural because in live-action lights have shape and texture. And can we do that in Blender? Sure we can. I have this scene with a very obvious eye reflection, flat, sharp, area light. Ugh, ugly. I'm gonna turn it into an eye spec. How do we do it? Area light selected, check use nodes in a shader workspace, and now I have a conveniently placed, hey, set of nodes in my clipboard. Now I'm gonna go through it. Texture coordinate, and I'm gonna select the area light object, and now you can see I have some coordinates that I can use to put gradient texture. Not that obvious right now, but with a color ramp, see? Hey, we're shaping this light. And now it's something that is a bit, well, way more beautiful. But sometimes we can even have more fun than that. Very often, when we get close to the characters, we can see more complex reflections than a simple eye speck. I love how obvious it gets in this scene from Frozen, where Anna's eye speck is changed for a reflection of Elsa's magic. Or same thing in Lightyear, when the shot's more intimate, we can now have a bit more narrative in the eyes. To get some more complex highlights, I sometimes do this, which is a very simple setup that converts these object coordinates into UV coordinates with a map range node set to vector and these values, to then project image textures on it. And basically you can project anything. I projected here a texture of some windows, and hey, it looks very, 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 very fancy. I sometimes even go as far as identifying what's the alleged key light source in my scene, taking a render of it and using that as a texture in a light that's gonna make reflections in my eyes. And wrapping things up, there's still way more things you can do with eyes. For example, some films have eye specs but prefer to have them tracked in the iris instead of locked in place, and you can do that with a single piece of geometry. Or you could just have black dots for everything, or no eyes at all. The most important thing, though, is for you to have the tools to make your character shine or get obsessed when you look at animation, and to know that this messy line in Miles Morales' eyes is there because of anatomy, and so is this Kate Mitchell's shape in the eye. That's it for me, thank you, bye!